Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Susan Reynolds with Friends for Survival, and today we are honored to welcome Jerry Reed in conversation with our Executive Director, Marilyn Koenig. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Thank you so much. We're so thrilled to have Jerry Reed with us today in this webinar. We've met in the early 90s, or late 90s, I should say, and it was the beginning of suicide awareness in the United States, actually. So Jerry's going to share a little bit about the history and the progress that was being made, and the involvement in survivors and how that changed the world, actually. So Jerry, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this whole issue of suicide.
Thank you, Marilyn, and it's really a delight to be with you again and to follow the work of Friends for Survival and rekindle a friendship that we've had for many, many years. I became involved, and when we met in the late 90s, it was as a result of my working with Senator Harry Reid from the state of Nevada. Senator Reid was a gentleman that, as I was a congressional fellow and needed to find an office to make a contribution to for a year or so, the Department of Defense had sent me over. I really liked the fact that he was on the aging committee, and I had a background in aging administration as a social worker and wanted to really rekindle my own love of working with older adults. So he accepted me for a year's service as a congressional fellow. I was a legislative assistant, and early on in my tenure with Senator Reid, the Aging Committee, of which Senator Reid was a member, had a hearing on mental health in the elderly. So as a good staffer, I called the state of Nevada, I spoke with the aging director, and I asked her, at the time her name was Suzanne, I said, what's the #1 mental health issue facing older adults in the state of Nevada? And without hesitation, she said suicide. And Marilyn, that really surprised me. I wasn't aware that suicide was a big problem in the state of Nevada. I didn't really have much experience with suicide myself, although I had people in my life and my community that I know had died by suicide. It wasn't something I was incredibly familiar with. So I prepared the points, the background paper, etc., for Senator Reid on suicide and the elderly. And we went to the hearing, and that day, Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes, the famed reporter, was there as a witness, and he was talking about his own battle with clinical depression. And as Mr. Wallace shared his own personal story, Senator Reid took the microphone and said, Mr. Wallace, if you're brave enough to tell the American people about your battle with depression, I need to be brave enough with the American people to share that my pop shot himself and took his own life. And that was the first time that Senator Reid had shared that publicly, that he in fact was a loss survivor. I certainly didn't know. And at that moment, it was like the sun, the moon, and the stars aligned. And Senator Reid, sharing his own story, turned to the chair of the committee, Senator Bill Cohen, who later went on to be our Secretary of Defense, and said, I would like very much for us to have a hearing on suicide in the elderly. And he turned around to me, who was sitting behind him, and said, Jerry, while you're here, I hope we can do something about suicide, which is the 11th leading cause of death in this country, and something up until now we really haven't addressed as responsibly as we should. So that began my involvement with suicide and its prevention that day with Senator Reid back in May of 1997, I believe, when all of a sudden my focus was going to be on suicide prevention. And at that time, an advocacy couple, Jerry and Elsie Wyrock from Marietta, Georgia, had read in their hometown newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution, that covered Senator Reid's admission of his own loss of his dad. And then they picked up the phone, called and said, could we have a meeting with Senator Reid? We'd like to talk to him about suicide. Having lost their own daughter, Terry, to suicide, we're on a mission to really raise awareness about this challenge that needed to be addressed. So that's where it all happened. And as Elsie used to always say, it's kind of a God thing. I think it was in many ways, destiny that put me there with Senator Reed and ultimately led me to you and Jerry and Elsie Weirach and a whole lot of other people that has allowed us to begin to honestly discuss suicide, its prevention, and our response with the hope of saving lives.
It was amazing how this really started, and it really was a miracle. I was so grateful that Jerry Weirach reached out to me. I was going to the national conferences at the time, and I remember hearing him speak for the first time from the podium, and I was really amazed. And at that point is when he began to reach out across the country to many people that were proactive in helping families that had had suicide deaths. And I was one of them that had a support group for survivors. And so that's where those are the people he reached out to. And thinking back, I think most of us were moms
Yep.
that had lost kids. And we finally had somebody that was interested in this. And because we didn't want more children, more other parents to have to go through what we were going through. We were already out there wanting something to change. Some suicide prevention effort needed to happen. And because we never heard about it in the years in the 70s when my son died, nobody talked about suicide. So here was somebody that had some contacts, some passion, and he got a team together.
Yes, you did.
And I was one of Jerry's girls. We were called one of Jerry's girls. And it was an amazing group of people that he assembled and developed this whole organization called SPAN USA, which was Suicide Prevention Advocacy Network.
Right.
So go on and tell us what happened after that, Jerry.
Well, my contribution was as the staffer to Senator Reed, who now had stepped forward to be a leader in Congress on the issue of suicide prevention. And that was on the Senate side. And on the House side, the congressman who represented Jerry and Elsie Weirach was Congressman John Lewis. We all know the famed John Lewis civil rights leader who introduced, along with Senator Reed, a resolution that basically said suicide is a national problem that warrants a national solution. And we need a national strategy for suicide prevention. That was what Jerry Weirach was pushing for, because it was time we addressed this issue. And you're right, he was really smart in recognizing that the voices of the lost survivors was going to be the political power that was missing. We have fabulous researchers and fabulous epidemiologists and wonderful state vital statistics people, but the numbers alone didn't convey the emotion that went with the loss, or the contributions that would never accrue because we were losing so many people prematurely to suicide. And so Jerry recognized that that community had a voice and a power that was missing. So by mobilizing Jerry's girls and a lot of other lost survivors and attempt survivors in the country, we began to have the power of people behind the message. So literally, Jerry and Elsie created an advocacy movement where people, they'd stand outside grocery stores and gas stations and churches, and people would sign these petitions saying, we need a national strategy and pass mental health parity. So a very simple message, but they would put their name and where they came from. And then Jerry and Elsie would identify the representative in Congress that represented that individual and the US senator that represented that individual. And in the early days, took thousands of these petitions up into Washington Capitol at the time. You could still take things in and deliver these petitions to these members of Congress saying, your constituents want action. And Jerry was one of those people that if he said the Red Sea should part, the Red Sea shall part. he was very, very persuasive. And so was Elsie. They just, there was no room for denial. You were going to act because the time has come. And so these people from all over the country who had lost a loved one were filling out these petitions and sending them to Jerry and Elsie's basement in Marietta, Georgia. They were assembling them and then delivering them once a year to Congress when all of the SPAN advocates came together for the SPAN conference. And Marilyn, that changed the world. All of a sudden, people were acting on suicide prevention, and the right people were paying attention.
I remember that first time in that we went to Washington, D.C. And of all the out in the East Lawn or whatever,
Yep.
we had this ceremony, and we had speakers, and I remember Mary, oh gosh, from Minnesota. I remember her speech saying, "We've done this and this," and she said, and then, but they're still dying, but they're still dying, that they're still dying, and she kept saying that. And the speaker, the only legislator that came to that meeting was John Lewis.
Yes.
And it was like, we've got somebody that is willing to even meet with us and take the passion and be interested. And I grew to really admire that man and watched him as one of my favorite legislators in the United States. He was amazing, but he was willing to speak up and say, I support this. I support this.
Yep.
Yeah.
He would say, never give up, never give out, never give in. And that was words that motivated the SPAN community to keep finding new champions, new advocates. And so he started, and then Senator Reed added, and then Tipper Gore added voice to this cause. And it just went on and on and on. And the Surgeon General of the United States added his voice to this cause, Dr. David Satcher. It was just, political will was born in front of us. And Jerry and Elsie and all of the team at SPAN USA, the advocates, knew just how to keep the heat on so we could get that national strategy and pass mental health parity. Paul Wellstone, you might remember, before his untimely death, was a strong champion of mental health parity. And so all like I said, the sun, the moon, and the stars aligned, and now we had the traction we needed to kind of move suicide prevention along the way we had moved obesity along or cancer along. Remember when we were younger, you wouldn't say the C word because you'd catch it. Well, of course, that was not true. And at the time that you and I met, we weren't saying the S word. Suicide was not a word that people would say because they were afraid that if you said it, you might put the idea in someone's head. And what we now know is just the opposite. By saying it, you let them know they're not alone and that you're a trusting, caring soul who will be there for them in their journey of recovery and healing.
Yeah, it was an amazing time. I had such wonderful memories of those many, many, many trips to Washington, D.C. every year. We just bombarded them every single year, made appointments, dropped off information, went to every single legislator in D.C. All the assembly members. And at that point, if you were from California, you went to the California ones. And so everybody had their states that they went to. So it was very personal contacts that we were trying to make. And we finally got something. We finally made traction, didn't we?
You did. And a member of Congress is going to listen to their own constituents first and foremost. So having the California people see the senators from California and their own representatives was absolutely brilliant. And it was advocacy 101. And SPAN USA deserves a lot of credit for bringing that voice to the table and not just paying lobbyists to do this work, but engaging the moms and the sisters and the brothers and the aunts and the uncles and the spouses in the work by sharing their own personal story. Many changes were made, and we did create a national strategy. We now have a revised national strategy. We're one of about 40 nations around the world who have a national strategy, and I frankly believe a very successful nation, because not only do we have a national strategy, we have an Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, which is the public-private partnership that meets twice a year that oversees the implementation of the national strategy. And so we're making progress as a country who now sees this as a very legitimate public health issue that warrants attention and action.
Yeah, it's been amazing. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the people that were involved in some of that? You mentioned a couple of names, but some people might not know who they were or what they kind of were about.
Well, in the early days, clearly Senator Reed and John Lewis and Paul Wellstone and Tipper Gore were the executive and legislative branch champions that really gave our nation permission to talk about suicide. And then we had Jerry Weirach and Elsie Weirach and Marilyn Koenig and Iris Bolton and Sandy Martin and Bunky Rifkin, and I could just go on and on and on with people who on the advocacy side were very passionate about linking up with these champions and giving them suggestions and ideas about what we could do as a nation to address the pain that is often the result of a suicide death and what we might do to prevent future deaths from occurring. In addition to people like that, you had Lloyd Potter, who was a public health advisor at the Center for Disease Control, and Dr. Mark Rosenberg, Dr. Jane Pearson, Dr. Richard McKeon, and Dr. Martino, who was just an amazing gentleman who worked at, his name was Robert DiMartino, a psychiatrist who worked at SAMHSA, and all of them had a role in suicide prevention from the executive branch agency that they worked in. So they brought the power of NIMH and CDC and SAMHSA to the conversation. And then our national strategy was used to write our defense national strategy and our veteran national strategy. So all of a sudden we had a whole of government, and I'll go even further and say a whole of nation response to suicide prevention, where everybody was doing their part to kind of make certain that we never again put suicide and its prevention under the carpet. We didn't sweep it under the carpet, but it was a public health issue that in many cases can be prevented. And we have to listen and learn from people in order to prevent that suicide and prevent others from going through the losses that many of our advocates went through. I think back so often on Sandy Martin. A lot of people won't know the name Sandy Martin, but you talk about a charger, a champion. Sandy had the idea that all these numbers, 33,000 people dying by suicide a year, one person every 85 or 90 or 100 minutes, that's a factoid that gets people's attention. But she said, we need to put faces on quilts, just like our HIV community did years ago, by putting faces on quilts to show people the human toll of suicide. And so every state in the nation created a quilt. They were called Lifekeeper quilts. And Sandy told people how big the quilt square should be. And each person got to do their own personal, piece of art, acknowledging their loved one. These quilts were assembled, and all of a sudden we would start taking them to state legislatures and through the Capitol, up on the lawn of the Capitol, and lay them out for people to see that not only are we talking about 33,000 suicides, we're talking about 33,000 families, 33,000 souls, and many tears that went behind each and every face on those quilts. And so we humanized the issue and made it real for people, which went on to contribute to the political will we were building to do something about suicide in the country. So those are just a few of those names.
Yeah, the first year we did the quilts, because I have our original one. We now have 6 quilts that we've made over the years, but we dated ours and it was 1998. And that was the first time we took them to an AA, American Association of Suicidology National Conference. And once we brought those quilts, the atmosphere at that conference changed forever. It was different. You could feel it. You could feel it because I think a lot of the researchers and so on, they didn't have that intimate connection necessarily to suicide, but when they had to look at these pieces, these faces, these persons, these smiling faces, and meet these families, it changed everything. It really did change everything, I think. And Sandy was such an amazing gal. I so enjoyed getting to know her. In fact, we had an article in a newsletter a couple years ago about her life that I wrote up and what she contributed, and she has since died, but it was their only child, so she was so passionate.
Son was Tony, but I still see Tony's picture on the quilt.
Yeah. It was amazing. And when we had them in Washington and they were laid out on we had some at press conferences too, when we flipped them from the faces to white and they're gone. And then we also had them sometimes on the ground, laid all out on the lawns in Washington, D.C., near the Capitol. What an amazing picture that was. And we did that for several years.
Just tourists would walk by, and it gave us a chance to talk about suicide and its prevention to the general public. Again, giving everybody permission to acknowledge something that was real. Sadly, it was real. But Harry Reid used to say, and by the way, his father was on the quilt for Nevada. I'll never forget the day I asked him, they would love to know if you'd put your dad's picture. He said, absolutely. So his father's picture was right on the quilt. But Harry Reid used to say all the time, God rest his soul, if you don't talk about suicide, you can't do anything about suicide. You have to acknowledge a challenge if you're going to address and fix a challenge. So we now are living examples of building research and implementing programs and building infrastructure. Every state in the nation has a state strategy for suicide prevention. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has chapters all over the country for people to connect with other loss survivors. Your organization, Friends for Survival, reaches hundreds of families every year who are new to this experience, providing comfort when they're feeling most alone in their life and have no idea where to turn. So I look back now, I'm retired. I look back and feel like this was a really fabulous experience. Starting that day with Senator Reid on the mental health and the elderly hearing, and where we went from there and how he gave me permission to help him move this thing along to the point of, we now have federal grants, thanks to people like Gordon and Sharon Smith, who lost their son Garrett to suicide. We now have youth suicide prevention grants and college suicide prevention grants. We have a system that just this week, now you only have to dial 988 if you're in mental health crisis to reach a caring community that will be there for you if you're struggling in silence at any hour of the day. I mean, that didn't exist in the late 90s, Marilyn, as you well.
No, it didn't. So let's go back to a little bit about how did you continue to be involved after the legislation and so on? I know that you worked for Harry Reid for several years.
Right.
And then there came a time when Jerry and Elsie found that they needed more help to run SPAN, and you became the executive director of SPAN.
That's right. when I finished my time with Senator Reed, I decided it was time for me, now that suicide had become so salient in my professional journey, I wanted to dedicate my life to this cause. So SPAN USA was moving to Washington, D.C. Jerry and Elsie had just done a phenomenal job running it out of Marietta, Georgia, but we had grown so much like Friends for Survival has grown, that we needed to establish a Washington, D.C. presence close to the Capitol where we could continue to make change. And I was asked if I would consider serving as the first executive director of SPAN USA. So from 2003 to 2008, I directed SPAN USA. And in the meantime, went back to graduate school and got my Ph.D. in suicide prevention in the elderly. So I actually pursued the very question that I was interested in knowing more about, which was older adults and suicide and mental health. So I worked for SPAN in those 5 years, got my PhD in 2008 or 2007, I think, in that period. And then I went to direct the National Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which was funded by Congress back in 2002, I think. One of the requirements in the first national strategy was to create a National Suicide Prevention Resource Center. And ironically, all these years later, when they were looking for a new executive director, after Dr. Lloyd Potter had made his contribution, I applied for the position and was selected. So I did that all the way through the end of my career until retirement in 2021, when I finally retired. So that moment, that one day, that destiny moment with Harry Reid, as you can see, Marilyn, did inform the rest of my career. And I'm still to this day involved in suicide prevention, even as a retiree. I'm privileged to serve on the Department of Defense Suicide Prevention and Response Independent Review Committee, recently established by the Secretary of Defense to look at suicide amongst our men and women in uniform.
Tell us a little bit about what does that National Office of that Suicide Prevention Resource Center, what did it do, or what did it, what was its mission?
Its mission in the very beginning was, as I recall, fourfold. It was to serve as a clearinghouse on suicide prevention information. So if this is a serious public health problem, we needed to make certain that people who wanted to do something about it had access to very significantly scientifically based information. So it was a clearinghouse for good information. It was also charged with creating the evidence base for suicide prevention. So we were asked to create a national registry of effective programs. What does work? What has science shown us works in the prevention of suicide? We were also charged with providing training. So things like the assessing and managing suicide risk, or the counseling for access to lethal means training program, or how to develop a state suicide prevention strategy. We were kind of created to fill a vacuum, or a void, I should say, that existed. Now that we had said we need a national strategy and everybody needs to do something about the prevention of suicide, the National Resource Center was created by Congress to be that one-stop shop where people could go to get reliable information to advance suicide prevention in their community.
Well, we've talked a lot about in this sharing about suicide prevention. And at one of the federal hearings that took place some years ago, not that long ago, maybe 10 years ago, 12, 14, I don't know exactly. But my thing is that sometimes the grief after a suicide death sort of gets lost in the suicide prevention. And for one thing, people who have had a suicide death in their family or friends feel like they failed to save that person. And so when you hear suicide is preventable, it's kind of like putting salt in our wounds.
Yeah,
But it didn't work for us. But the fact of the matter is that families after a suicide death, family friends, are now at a higher risk. We know that from the research. And if we are suicide prevention, we just look different.
yeah,
And we now call that postvention, which
Yeah.
for some people may not know, they probably have heard the term, but that's in the aftermath of a suicide death. It's called postvention. They're also using that right now as attempters too, that have survived an attempt and are still alive, that's postvention too. But the important thing is the Suicide Prevention Resource Center also accepted our manual on how to start and how to start a postvention peer support program after a suicide death, and our manual was accepted as one of the what do we call it, qualified as a, I can't think of the right word, legitimate resource. What do we call best practices? That's what I'm saying. So it's a best practice, one of the best practices for having a postvention and helping families after a suicide death. So it's been a great resource for many, many, many people. A lot of people wouldn't even know that that resource even exists.
Yeah.
But it's just great that we now have that as a national office to
Yeah.
get information, and legitimate information that is certainly critiqued and reviewed and edited by people that have the ability to evaluate different programs and so on. So it's really has changed so much of everything for us.
Yeah, man, I would encourage all your listeners to go to www.sprc.org, and your manual, as well as hundreds of other well validated resources, have been added to make it a little bit less difficult for people to figure out where to turn and what to do.
Mhm.
So that was the whole purpose. And the SPRC is around, it's been around since 2002. It continues to add information as it's developed. And so it's really a phenomenal one-stop shop for people to get just about anything that they need in the prevention category, the intervention category, and as you correctly stated, the postvention category. And I just want to comment to what you said, because I agree with you 100%. When people say suicide is preventable, they don't mean in any way to imply that, as you said, salt in the wound. It's really how much more aware we are now by virtue of you sharing your voice with the field, or attempt survivors sharing their voice with the field, so we can learn things we may never have known about that experience, so that we might improve prevention for future generations. We only know what we know at the time we know it. And so it is a constant process of learning more, applying more, doing more. And we still lose far too many people every year to suicide. And as you and I both know, we're still learning. But I think we are so much wiser today than we were in 1996. And I have no doubt that we will be wiser in 2026 than we are today, because of our constant passion to learn more and apply new practices that can honor someone who's in a very difficult period in their life.
Yeah. And the professionals have more training now, and we've got Lifeline with the 988. So that'll make it easier for people to go call the crisis line. They don't have to remember that long number anymore. 988 is going to help that a lot.
There's a respect, I think, of the practitioners, the providers, and the researchers of the voice of loss survivors and attempt survivors, and there's far more collaboration between loss survivors and attempt survivors with researchers and program developers. That's going to make us all stronger.
Yes, absolutely.
Worlds, we're flying in formation in one direction to save lives.
Yeah, it's just amazing how things have changed a great deal. I'm amazed, but there's always some new things that we can do, new things as we embark on our 40th anniversary next year in 2023. I just never knew I'd be doing this long, but I have met some of the most wonderful people throughout these years. And, if my son hadn't died by suicide, I wouldn't have met any of you. I wouldn't know any of you. I wouldn't have had any of these experiences, which have been so encouraging and so uplifting. The great times we had when we went to Washington, D.C. to advocate, Jerry and Elsie, one of the things that she was so innovative. I remember one time for desserts, and when we were having the picnic in the evening or something, and they brought in the coolers, and we had ice cream bars. Like, we never would have thought of ice cream bars. Anyway, we had such a great time together. It's because we were all working together for something worthwhile, and it gave a lot of meaning to our lives. And many of us have done it almost to the end. I know Iris, even though she's retired and she wrote that wonderful book, My Son, she still got her finger in it too. We've had some discussions recently.
You reckoned with.
Yeah. But from my standpoint, I want to get some more national effort done as far as the support groups in this country, and see if we can't, have high quality support groups. And it's hard because there's a lot of work behind the scenes that people don't know about that you have to do that. But it's so worthwhile to have people be encouraged and more aware of suicide and how to prevent it and how to be helpful to other people in the future, which we wouldn't have known otherwise. If we hadn't been through this, we wouldn't know this. So it's been a great time of education and everything. And your involvement was so important. And the reason I asked you if you would do this webinar is because I knew you've been there from day one. And so more so than anybody else, you've been there since day one and saw all of this happening and have all this information.
I believe in being blessed, and I think I have been given a gift beyond description to be part of this community, to recognize what authentic love really is, what it's like to work in a community that really cares about an outcome and a passion. I tell people I've been in so many. I was in the Senate with Senator Reid. I was with the Surgeon General. I was in the federal government. I was an advocate. I've been at every side of the table and saw our government work as a government is supposed to work. And I will leave this world someday a better man because of my experience with the suicide prevention community and the wonderful people I've met along the way. How many guys can honestly say they had a chance to see the world improve as a result of the ringside seat they had? I can say that. And I'm very grateful for the experience. And I will say this, Marilyn, it's sometimes overlooked, but the voice of the loss survivor gave us permission to hear more directly now from the voice of the attempt survivor.
Mm-hmm.
The lived experience, a term that we never heard of in 1996 and 97, is now almost part of every community that's got a cause they care about. Not about us, without us. Don't talk about suicide if you don't talk to me about my experience having lost my son, in your case, or my husband in the case of a woman who may have lost her veteran husband. We learn so much more when we engage the actual community that's been touched by an event, rather than thinking we can study it without that experience. So I think now we have attempt survivor groups, and that lived experience is telling us, don't lock me up in a 3-day, psychiatric hospital. That's going to be more traumatizing than you can ever imagine. And I'll never again ask for help after that experience. We know that now. And so we're looking for alternatives to be more compassionate and less trauma insensitive to folks that are needing mental health stabilization at a time of crisis. We are getting better, Marilyn.
We are getting better.
We're not there yet, but we're getting better.
Well, it's always true about not just suicide, but any other thing, living through cancer or whatever particular situation in each one's lives. If you talk to the people that are involved in it, we can all learn a lot. The researchers can learn a lot. We can learn from each other. The experience is valuable. It has real merit, even though you might feel like you're kind of alone in it. But what do you see? We hear, over the years, I remember we've talked about veteran suicide, and now I understand that you're working a bit with the Defense Department in veterans and the suicide issue around veterans, either while in their active duty or afterwards. So what does it look like now, and where are we with that? Is there anything new on the horizon regarding getting extra care for our veterans?
There's a lot that's going on. Like I said, both the Department of Defense and the Veterans Department have strategies for reducing suicide amongst our active duty military and the veteran community. There's an infrastructure that's built. Every VA hospital has a suicide prevention coordinator that is there to facilitate services for a veteran in need. All of the military services, the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Air Force, all have department leads in suicide prevention. The Secretary of Defense has established this suicide prevention and response independent review committee. So people are aware of the challenge and want to do the right thing with the challenge. So like I said, we're not completely there yet because the numbers haven't gone down, but I think we're learning things. For example, when I first came in the field, we used to always say that 90% of all suicides had a mental health or substance misuse connection. What we're now learning is that about 54% of suicides have an environmental factor, a relationship breakup, a financial breakup, a legal issue, a custody issue. There are a lot of things other than just mental health and substance misuse that could contribute to suicide. That opens up a whole path of prevention opportunities. So if someone's going through a divorce, can we do something to help minimize the trauma of that divorce? Maybe so. If a company is closing in rural America because it just can't afford to stay open, are we able to build in a transition assistance program for people that are going to be affected and therefore might have financial challenges? There's so much we can do by learning from people who have gone through a loss like this, and understand that it was the financial burden, or it was the custody burden, or it was the breakup of a relationship that led them to really question whether living was an option they could make real. So I think I'm really happy. I think we have a nation responding to the issue of suicide. I think we're on the right path. In 2020 and 2019, numbers did go down a little bit, not nearly enough. As we've all said so many times, one suicide is too many. We have a long way to go, but I think we're moving in the right direction. And as Harry Reid said, if you don't talk about it, you can't do anything about it. And I think we are talking about it in a way now that will help us provide the support people need when they need it, how they need it.
Yeah. I agree with you. It is getting better. Certainly we hear about suicide a lot now compared to, and in positive ways of about how can we make a difference in all of this, because it's so hard. It's very difficult. We listen to so many stories, and we have people that even attend a Zoom meeting as early as 4 days after the death. I mean, they're out looking for help right away, which is amazing, because when my son died in 1977, I wouldn't have thought to call or ask for anything. I just cried and cried and cried and cried and cried and cried. I mean, I didn't think there was anybody out there. I didn't know anybody else. At least I thought I didn't know anybody else that had ever died by suicide. But the trauma that people have after a suicide death is just immense. It's just immense for people, the family.
Your contribution in the postvention space, Marilyn, again, in the first national strategy for suicide prevention, I don't think we even talked about postvention. We do now. We sure do now, because we know that postvention is prevention for the
It is.
next generation. And
Yeah.
you help people adjust in a healthy way to their reality. That could be life-saving for them down the road. And I just know that what you do for people who've experienced that loss is therapeutic. It's cathartic. It helps them realize they're not alone. So God bless you. Keep doing it.
Well, they don't need to cry alone like I did for 2-3 years before my brain would re-engage again. I just didn't know of anybody that I could talk to. But you know what? I also didn't know the words. I didn't have the words for it. I just didn't have any words for it. I had a friend who came up to me after my son died and said, Marilyn, I didn't come by because I didn't know what to say. And I looked at her, good friend of mine, I said, I don't know what to say either. I mean, you are left with just shock and trauma. It's just so overwhelming that you need somebody that can hold your hand while you cry.
Well, you probably know our dear friend Frank Campbell, who used to say, so many loss survivors are stuck in the canyon of why. Right after that suicide death, you're just in a canyon of why, and nobody. Sometimes I don't know what to say. People have told me, just say their name. Just say their name and listen. And even if we don't talk, just be with me.
Yeah.
That's enough at that moment. And I think if I've learned one thing, Iris Bolton, our dear friend, once said to me, I said, Iris, I'm not a loss survivor. Can I go to the healing ceremony? She said, of course you can. But I didn't even know at the time that I could go, because I didn't want people to think I didn't belong there. And I was so sensitive about doing the wrong thing. She said, the more that come, the better we feel. So, you live and learn every day something by virtue of the openness to our conversation. So
yeah, absolutely.
You're my heroine, and I thank you for all you've done.
You're one of my heroes too. I said, well, you're one of the good guys that has really been in this, not because it was a career, but because it was a passion and something you dearly felt a real commitment to. And even in your retirement, you're still doing it.
I think about one thing, Marilyn, there but for the grace of God could go I. And boy, have I learned that over 35 years. So I'm here because I'm meant to be here, and I get more out of it than I get to it. So, amen on that, right?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I get more out of this than I ever gave. But none of us know if a particular set of circumstances could come up that we would find ourselves in the same state of mind, thinking, I don't want to go on. I can't do this anymore. I'm tired. I'm worn out. I've done my best, but I can't go on. And we don't know. I haven't been there, so I don't know what that's really like, because I haven't been there. But it's certainly just is such a tragedy when there is a suicide death and for everybody.
Yeah,
So we have all these wonderful, loving families that contact us because they really cared about the person that died. It wasn't like they didn't care.
of course.
In the family, the people that died by suicide had, for the most part, loving, caring people around them, but it was still more
Wasn't
than they could bear.
it just, I think that when, what I often feel is that the pain of living for the individual who dies was greater than the pain of dying. The pain of dying was greater than the pain of living.
Yeah.
It's just so sad that I can't imagine being that alone. But it just is what it is, and we have to provide the support to each other after this event occurs, and hopefully we'll learn from it and prevent others from having to experience that pain.
Yes. Well, we're going to keep at it, Jerry, and I'm just so thankful to have you today with us and to do this webinar and any other ways we can work together with you. We would appreciate that. I'm very excited that you are willing to do this in your retirement and join us today and kind of give our survivor families or anyone else that finds this webinar and watches it, realizing how so many people contributed to the fact that we now do have Suicide Prevention National Office. We have a 988 short number to use to get to the crisis lines. You don't have to be suicidal to call the crisis line.
That's
You
right.
can just be struggling and need somebody to talk to, or you might have a friend who is at risk and you want to know how you can better help them. You can call 988 for that too. And so we were able to garner a lot of government support and encouragement and financial support over the years. And it really happened because of survivors speaking up.
Yeah.
And it's pretty hard to not listen to family members who are saying, my son died, or my brother, or my parent, or somebody that died, and kind of brush you off and like it was nothing.
Not gonna,
This kind of hits something that they're not familiar with, and so they do listen and find out, oh gosh, there's more to it. We need to do something and help people. So we all work together on it, and we made a lot of progress, and we're still making progress, and we're going to keep going, aren't we, Jerry?
you betcha, man. I'm with you. As I said, you had me at hello. So as long as I'm around and you're around, we'll keep doing good things together. And thank you to Friends for Survival for your wonderful work and for inviting me here today.
Okay, thank you so much, Jerry. We'll look forward to seeing you again, maybe on something else that we might be doing.
I hope.
Okay.
Talk later.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.